So the topic of this video is good and bad news about NHS waiting time data. To be absolutely honest though, there's a lot more bad than good news. I'm actually a really positive person and I'm noticing that a lot of my videos are really negative. And the next videos that I'm doing will also be very negative. But the UK is in a mess and it's important that we're honest about that. So where there is positive news, I want to highlight it. If we look at the total NHS waiting list, it did go down in both October and November, the two most recent months for which we have data. The waiting list fell from a peak of 7.77 million in September to 7.61 million in November, a fall of around 150,000. This is good news. It's the first time that there's been a clear downward turn since before COVID. 150,000 people coming off the waiting list is a really good thing. There's a lot of people that are now getting their treatment. However, it's a tiny reduction. The Prime Minister pledged to reduce waiting lists in 2023 and quite the opposite has happened. The waiting list dramatically increased. The reduction is tiny in relation to the increase just in 2023. And minuscule in relation to the increase that we've seen since this government came into power in 2010. Sunak is blaming the strikes for the fact that the waiting list is still so high. A few days ago he was challenged by a former NHS worker about the state of the health service. It's worth googling the clip if you haven't seen it. Just as an aside, she says that she'd like the NHS to go back to what it used to be. Sunak has been criticised for laughing at that. I think it's a nervous, awkward more than a mocking laugh, but it just shows what happens when he's challenged with the truth. Just on the waiting list, it's gone up from around 2.5 million when the Tories came into power to more than 7.5 million now. The Tories have managed to treble it. We'd all like to go back to what it used to be. Anyway, Sunak says in that encounter that when there were no strikes in October and November, the waiting list fell by 150,000. He proclaimed that when there aren't strikes, we can really make progress. Of course, we can ask how the waiting list increased in the first place. The dotted line shows the period that the Tories have been in power, pre-COVID, pre-strikes. The Conservatives have presided over a big increase in the waiting list, but no one ever talks about this. Going back to the reduction Sunak claimed when there were no strikes, we can do a back-of-the-envelope calculation here. 150,000 reduction in 2 months would be a reduction in 900,000 over a year. To get back to 2.5 million, therefore, would take more than 5 years at this rate. I don't think that's actually good enough. And even 2.5 million is too high. We're one of the richest countries in the world. Why can't we have an NHS with 0 waiting lists? There's a simple answer to this question, of course: money. To really make a dent in the waiting list is going to require massive investment in the NHS. And this can only happen with a tax increase to pay for it. Not a tax on ordinary people, but taxing the super wealthy. See my videos on tax for more on this. For this month's data release, I took a bit of a closer look at the breakdown of the waiting list data. This chart shows the waiting list split into how long people have been waiting. What's interesting about the chart is the increase in super long waiting times since COVID. We can zoom in on this and see what's going on. We see that COVID created new categories of waiting times. For all these categories over 12 months, there has been progress in reducing the numbers. However, those waiting more than 12 months haven't seen any significant reduction since COVID. 12 months does seem short compared to the other durations people have been waiting. However, just stop and think about it. 1 year is a long time to wait for a treatment to start, and some of these people have died when they could have been saved if treated sooner. This just isn't good enough for one of the richest countries in the world. So the good news is tiny in relation to the continued bad news on waiting lists. I also took a look at the average response times for ambulances. This is broken down into categories. C1 is the most serious, immediately life-threatening and time-critical illnesses, such as cardiac or respiratory arrest. Although there was an increase in wait times in the year 22-23 to 9 minutes 18 seconds, there was a reduction to 8 minutes 28 seconds in this financial year so far. This is good news. And overall, this seems to be a performance indicator where the NHS is actually doing consistently well. 8 minutes seems like a good performance for these most serious cases. The second category, emergency calls such as stroke or chest pain, here the performance isn't as good. The average was around 20 to 25 minutes, but then dramatically increased to a high of 50 minutes. It's down at 36 minutes this year, but even 25 minutes doesn't seem that good, so the increase to 50 minutes seems terrible. As with the waiting list, the decrease from the high of 2022 to 23 is good news. But the bad news is that on average, you're going to have to wait 36 minutes for an ambulance if you're having chest pain or a stroke. Finally, here's some more bad news when looking at the number of patients spending 12 hours from the decision to admit to hospital admission. These are people who come into A&E for whom it's determined that they're sick enough to be admitted to hospital, yet they're left waiting on a trolley in a corridor for more than 12 hours. The big increase in the trolley waits came in 2022, so it's not obvious that it's anything to do with COVID. In December 23, 45,000 people lay on a trolley for more than 12 hours waiting to be admitted to hospital. Again, this feels like something that should not be happening in one of the richest countries in the world. Fingers crossed that we'll continue to see an improvement in the waiting list. However, with the government looking to decrease taxes this year, there's unlikely to be sufficient resources to make any real dent in the list to get back to where we were. The only solution is an increase in resources, and I think that we should make this happen. I hope you found this information useful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.